When I went to the lake, God told me Mike was not in Lake Seminole. He didn't drown. He didn't get eaten by alligators. I had to find him and bring him home.
In December of 2000, a man went duck hunting on his anniversary morning and simply vanished. No body, no blood, no struggle, just an empty boat with a full tank of gas. For 18 years, his family was told it was an accident. They were wrong, and the truth was closer than anyone imagined. Let's go back to the beginning. Mike Williams and Denise Williams weren't just high school sweethearts. They grew up together in the small town of Tallahassee, Florida. Mike was the football star. Denise was the cheerleader. The kind of couple everyone in school assumed would end up together, and they did. By the time Mike was in his late 20s, life looked like it was going exactly according to plan. He had built a successful career as a real estate agent and insurance broker. He was well-known, well-liked, the kind of guy who made friends easily and never seemed to have an enemy in the world. He married Denise, and together they had a daughter. They bought a house in a quiet Tallahassee neighborhood. On the surface, it was the picture of small-town success, the football star and the cheerleader, living the life they'd always planned. But there was someone else in the picture too, Brian Winchester. Brian had been Mike's best friend since childhood. The two were inseparable, hunting buddies, business partners, the guy who was always at Mike's house, always around the family. Brian was even the best man at Mike and Denise's wedding. He was, by every appearance, the most trusted person in Mike's life. What Mike didn't know was that his best friend and his wife had a secret, one that had been building for years, hidden in plain sight. By December of 2000, Mike and Denise had been married for 6 years. To the outside world, they looked like any other young family. But behind closed doors, the marriage was already cracking. And on the morning of December 16th, 2000, their 6th wedding anniversary, Mike got up early, grabbed his hunting gear, and headed out to Lake Seminole for a duck hunt. It was a trip he'd taken dozens of times before. This time, he wouldn't come home. That morning, Mike said goodbye to Denise and their daughter and drove to Lake Seminole, just like he had so many times before. He told Denise he'd be back by noon. They had plans for their anniversary that evening. Noon came and went, then the afternoon, then evening. By nightfall, Denise called Mike's mother, Cheryl, in a panic. Mike wasn't answering his phone. He hadn't come home, and it wasn't like him. Mike was reliable, especially on a day as important as their anniversary. Denise reported him missing that evening, and within hours, search teams were mobilized to Lake Seminole. What they found and didn't find would shape the next 18 years. Mike's boat was located on the lake, drifting. Inside were his hunting gear, his dog, and his shotgun. The boat's gas tank was full, meaning Mike hadn't been out on the water for very long before whatever happened, happened. There was no blood, no signs of a struggle, no note, nothing to suggest where Mike had gone or what had happened to him. Search and rescue teams launched one of the largest operations the area had ever seen. Over the following weeks, divers, boats, helicopters, and dog teams combed the lake and surrounding wetlands. In total, crews spent 44 days and logged more than 700 hours searching for any trace of Mike. They found nothing. No body, no clothing, no equipment beyond what was already in the boat. Lake Seminole is known for one thing in particular: alligators. And it didn't take long for that detail to work its way into the investigation. Officials began to float a theory. Maybe Mike had fallen overboard and the lake's alligator population had taken care of the rest. It was a theory that fit the evidence. It was clean, it was simple, and for investigators eager to close the case, it was convenient. But there was a problem with that theory, and it came from someone who knew Mike better than almost anyone: his mother. From the very beginning, Cheryl Williams didn't believe the official story. December in North Florida is cold, and as Cheryl pointed out to anyone who would listen, alligators don't feed in cold water. Their metabolism slows down dramatically once temperatures drop, and feeding activity becomes rare. For an alligator, or several alligators, to completely consume a grown man, leaving absolutely no trace in near-freezing water, it didn't add up, and there was something else that bothered her. Months after the search was called off, fishermen began finding pieces of Mike's hunting equipment in the lake: his jacket, his waders, his hunting license. But here's the strange part. These items weren't waterlogged, decayed, or torn apart. They looked clean, almost untouched, as if they'd been sitting somewhere dry for months and then placed in the water much more recently than December. To Cheryl, it looked staged. She also couldn't shake a detail about the shotgun found in Mike's boat. Mike was an experienced hunter who had a specific gun he used for duck hunting. The gun found in the boat that day, it wasn't his usual one. Cheryl raised these concerns to investigators. She begged them to keep digging, to treat this as more than just a tragic accident. But without a body, without evidence of foul play, and with a theory that conveniently explained away all the missing pieces, the case went cold. In 2006, 6 years after Mike vanished, Denise petitioned the court to have him legally declared dead. Normally, Florida law requires a 5-year waiting period for this kind of ruling in cases without a body. Denise's petition was processed faster, and using the staged evidence pulled from the lake, the court granted it. With Mike officially declared dead, Denise was now eligible to collect on a life insurance policy, a policy worth $1.5 million, a policy that had been taken out just 6 months before Mike disappeared. And the man who sold it to him? Brian Winchester, Mike's best friend. To understand what happened next, you have to go back further than December 2000. According to what would later come out in court, Denise and Brian's affair didn't start after Mike disappeared. It started years before, as early as 1997, while Mike was still very much alive and while Brian was still playing the role of his best friend. Think about that for a moment. Brian was at family dinners. Brian went hunting with Mike. Brian stood up at Mike's wedding, and the entire time he was carrying on a relationship with Mike's wife. By the time Mike vanished, the affair had been going on for roughly 3 years. After Mike was declared dead and Denise received the insurance payout, she didn't disappear or move away to start fresh somewhere new. She did something that, in hindsight, looks almost brazen. She married Brian, and the two of them moved into the house Denise had shared with Mike. The same house where Mike's daughter had grown up. They used Mike's life insurance money to help fund their new life together, a life built, quite literally, on top of the old one. For Mike's family, this was devastating. Cheryl and Mike's brother Nick had already lost Mike. Now they were watching the man they believed responsible, or at least in their gut, living in his house, married to his wife, raising his daughter. And then Denise made a decision that would cut the relationship entirely. She limited Cheryl's access to her own granddaughter, Mike's daughter. According to Cheryl, Denise made it clear, if she kept pushing questions about Mike's disappearance, kept doubting the official story, kept causing problems, she would lose access to the little girl altogether. For years, Cheryl was caught in an impossible position: stay quiet and maintain a relationship with her granddaughter. Speak up and risk losing her entirely. So the case stayed cold. Denise and Brian built a life, and Mike Williams remained officially a tragic accident, a man who went hunting one morning and was never seen again. For 17 years, that's where the story stayed, until one night in 2017 when Brian Winchester's life completely fell apart, and he took the truth down with him. By 2017, Denise and Brian's marriage, the one built in the shadow of Mike's disappearance, was falling apart. The two were going through a divorce, and by all accounts, it was ugly. Years of resentment, paranoia, and the weight of a secret they'd carried for nearly 2 decades had taken their toll on both of them. Then, one night, Brian Winchester did something that would change everything. He confronted Denise, and he did it with a gun. According to reports, Brian forced Denise into her car at gunpoint, driving her around while threatening her, in what investigators would later describe as a kidnapping. Denise managed to escape, and she went straight to the police.
I was like, are you planning on, ending both of our lives today? Well, mine. I'm planning on mine. And then he would say, I want to kill myself. He must have said 1,000,000 times.
Brian was arrested. And suddenly, the man who had spent 17 years helping maintain a carefully constructed story was facing serious prison time for an entirely separate crime. For investigators, this was the opening they'd been waiting for without even knowing it. With Brian now facing real consequences, and with his relationship with Denise completely destroyed, something shifted. The loyalty, the protection, the silence that had held for nearly 2 decades, it started to crack. Investigators reopened the case. They began applying pressure. And faced with the possibility of spending the next 20 years in prison for the kidnapping charge, Brian Winchester made a decision that would finally bring Mike Williams' story to an end. He decided to talk. In a deal with prosecutors, Brian Winchester agreed to tell investigators exactly what happened to Mike Williams on December 16, 2000, and to lead them to his remains. In exchange, he would plead guilty to second-degree murder and accessory after the fact, avoiding the possibility of a life sentence or the death penalty. What he revealed matched almost nothing the public had been told for 17 years. According to Brian, the affair with Denise had been ongoing for years, and by 2000, Denise wanted out of her marriage. But divorce, in her mind, wasn't an option. Her family held strong religious beliefs that made divorce unacceptable. On top of that, she didn't want to risk losing custody of her daughter or splitting their assets with Mike. Brian claimed that Denise told him there was, in her words, only one solution. So the two of them began to plan. 6 months before Mike disappeared, Brian, who worked in insurance, quietly took out a policy on Mike's life worth $1.5 million. Mike's family believes to this day that Mike never knew the policy existed. Then came December 16, 2000. That morning, Brian told Mike he wanted to show him a new spot on the lake, somewhere good for duck hunting that Mike hadn't tried before. Mike, trusting his best friend completely, went along without hesitation. Once they were out on the water, Brian made his move. As Mike stood up in the boat, Brian shoved him overboard. The plan, according to Brian, was for Mike's heavy hunting gear, his waders, his jacket, his boots, to weigh him down and drag him under the cold water before he could resist. But it didn't go as planned. Mike didn't go under. He grabbed onto a tree stump in the water and held on, fighting to stay alive. That's when Brian shot him. Afterward, Brian loaded Mike's body into the boat, transported it several miles away, and buried it on a piece of property belonging to the Winchester family, land that had been in Brian's family for generations. Back at home, Denise's role was simple: stay put, act normal, and provide an alibi. She told everyone, including the police, that she'd been home that entire morning with their daughter. According to Brian, this alibi was something the two of them had discussed and agreed upon in advance. By that evening, Denise reported Mike missing. The search began, and the story that would stand for the next 17 years was set in motion. As part of his plea deal, Brian Winchester led investigators to the property where he said he'd buried Mike's body back in 2000. In December of 2017, almost exactly 17 years after Mike disappeared, investigators recovered human remains from the site. Forensic testing confirmed what Cheryl Williams had believed for nearly 2 decades. It was Mike. He had been buried just a few miles from the neighborhood where he grew up, close to the lake, close to home, the entire time. For Cheryl, it was the answer she had spent 18 years fighting for, but it also confirmed her worst fear. Mike hadn't drowned. He hadn't been taken by an alligator. He had been murdered by the two people he trusted most, his wife and his best friend. With Brian's confession in hand, prosecutors moved forward with charges against Denise Williams. She was arrested in 2017 and charged with first-degree murder, conspiracy to commit murder, and accessory after the fact. Denise's defense argued that Brian acted alone, that he killed Mike out of his own obsession with Denise without her knowledge or involvement, and that his testimony against her was simply an attempt to reduce his own sentence. But prosecutors pointed to the insurance policy, the timeline of the affair, the rehearsed alibi, and Brian's detailed confession, all of which painted a picture of two people who had planned this together. In December of 2018, the case went to a jury. After deliberating for just 8 hours, the jury found Denise Williams guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. For Cheryl Williams, after 18 years of being told she was wrong, that it was just a tragic accident, that she needed to move on, she finally heard the words she'd been waiting for: justice. For Mike. The appeal, and where things stand today. For a while, it seemed like the story was finally over. Denise was in prison, Brian had confessed, Mike had been found and laid to rest. After 18 years, the Williams family finally had closure. But the legal story didn't end there. Denise's defense team appealed her conviction, and in 2023, a Florida appellate court made a significant ruling. The court found that the trial judge had made an error in how the jury was instructed regarding Brian Winchester's testimony. specifically how jurors were told to weigh the credibility of an accomplice who testified as part of a plea deal. As a result, the appellate court overturned Denise's first-degree murder conviction. However, and this is important, the court upheld her conviction on the conspiracy charge. Denise was resentenced and is currently serving a 30-year sentence for conspiracy to commit murder. It's an outcome that's left many people frustrated. The murder conviction, the most serious charge, the one that matched what Brian described in his confession, was overturned on a technicality related to jury instructions, not because new evidence emerged or because anyone believes Denise is innocent. For Cheryl Williams and the rest of Mike's family, it's been yet another chapter in a fight that never seems to fully end. They got the truth. They got a body to bury. But the full measure of justice they fought 18 years for has, in some ways, been pulled back out of reach. Mike Williams went out on a lake one December morning on what should have been a celebration. 6 years of marriage, a daughter at home, a life he'd built with people he loved and trusted. Instead, the two people closest to him had already decided his fate. For 17 years, the world believed he was a victim of nature. Bad luck, bad timing, an accident in a dangerous lake. The truth was so much worse and so much closer to home. Today, Mike rests where he should have all along, at home, with his family, with the truth finally known. But for Cheryl Williams, the fight for justice, real, lasting justice, may not be over yet.